Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. Today's tutorial is going to be another steampunk Lolita blouse using the McCall's 7071. This is a much simpler type of blouse, but sometimes you need a simple piece to complete a look. And it's really nice that this one can go a bunch of different ways, from steampunk to Lolita to just casual wear, because it turned out to be a really nice blouse in general. And thankfully it doesn't take too much notions to actually put it together either. I will be making mine in a size 18 and the blouse is view B. I am using just a basic cotton fabric like usual, and I did pre-wash to accommodate for any shrinking. You're gonna need 8 pattern pieces going from number 10 to number 17. So of course you're going to cut out all of your pieces first and foremost, and then you're gonna go through with each piece and you're gonna mark all of your dots and your notches, as well as any center folds and placement lines. This pattern also has a few darts in it, so go ahead and mark those as well. We're going to begin with our number 10 front piece, and we're going to start on the wrong side to make the darts. So I'm going to start by pinching the fabric together to match the 2 center dots. And I'm going to place a pin. I'm going to pinch the fabric to angle down toward that bottom dot, and I'll place another pin, and then I'll do the same thing to the top dot. So it should kind of look like a very long triangle of fabric sticking up. Then you can go ahead and do this to the other dart. Once your darts are pinned, we're going to sew these into our blouse. So when you go to your machine, you're going to start at one end dot and angle toward that middle dot, sewing a straight line. And then once I get to that middle dot, I'm just going to lift my foot and pivot the fabric a little bit to angle toward the next dot. And from there, I'm just going to sew a straight line to that one. So basically, you're just connecting the dots. You're going to press both these darts with your iron, making sure they face to the sides of your blouse. We're going to grab our lower ruffle piece, and on one side we're going to do a straight stitch of a 5/8 inch seam allowance. From here we're going to fold up that same edge so that your fold is just slightly past that seam allowance we just sewed. And then we'll iron this down in place all the way across. And then taking your scissors, you're going to cut off the excess seam allowance above that seam as close as you can get to that thread without actually cutting it. From here, you're going to fold up that bottom edge again, right up to that edge that we cut. And then we'll press this in place as well. And from here, we're going to sew it down with the 1/16 inch seam allowance. On the opposite edge of this strip, we're going to do 2 gathering base stitches. Start with a 3 to 4 inch tail of thread. And we're going to sew a base stitch of a 1/16 inch seam allowance. Make sure to leave a 3 to 4 inch tail of thread at the end as well, and then do the same thing at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Taking the top 2 threads, you're going to gently pull, and this will start to gather our ruffle. You can also gather from the other end as well, making sure it's the same top 2 threads. So we're going to gather this just a bit, and then we're going to grab our front piece once again with right side face up, and we're going to line out this ruffle along the placement line to figure out the length of the ruffle that we need, and then you can pin the ends down to hold it in place. From here, you're going to go through the ruffle and distribute the gathers evenly. And once you're happy with it, you can go ahead and start pinning the ruffle down. We're going to sew this ruffle on by matching the 3/8 inch seam allowance with the placement line. So as you're sewing with your machine, just line it up as you go, making sure that the thread is right above that placement line. Then we're going to re-sew down that seam allowance at 1/4 inches so that that little bit of extra fabric is tacked down as well. Grab the upper ruffle and we're going to do the same exact thing that we did with the lower ruffle, from hemming one side to adding your gathering base stitches on the other. This time we're going to gather up the ruffle enough to match the raw edge of the ruffle with the edge of the neckline. Then you can pin down the ends. Once you have your length, evenly distribute your ruffles and pin it down. We're going to sew this on with the 3/8 inch seam allowance. At the shoulder ends, lay out the ruffle edges so that they lay nice and neat on the edge. And you can pin these down. And then we'll sew the ruffle edges with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. The next piece we're working with is the inset. So lay your front piece with wrong side face up, and your inset will lay wrong side face up, and then lift up the seam allowance on the front piece and match it with the right side edge of your inset. So right side should be faced together, and you're going to go through and evenly pin this together. It is a little awkward on those curved corners, so just take your time, play with the fabric until it sits the way that you want it to. We're going to sew this with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now with this seam allowance, there's 2 things you can do. You can sew the seam allowance at another 1/4 inches and then trim as close to that 1/4 seam allowance as you can. Or you can do like I did and just serge the edge, if you have a serger available. Take your iron and press the seam allowance towards the center of your inset. Grab your 2 back pieces, open them up, and once again we're going to pin and sew the darts like we did on the front. Iron these darts toward the side edge of each piece. And then we're going to lay both of these right sides together, matching that bottom edge. Place a few pins, and going from the 3 notches down to the bottom, you're going to sew a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Take your front piece and now line the back piece up with right sides together. You're going to match your sides and pin that together, and your shoulder seams, and match this together too. We're going to sew these 4 sections with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Go through and iron open your seams. Moving up to the neckline, we're going to do a stay stitch at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Grab your collar pieces next, and I'm going to mark my center front on both pieces. And then taking one collar piece, iron on your inner facing to the back. On the second piece, we're going to mark a 5/8 inch seam allowance from the bottom edge. Fold this up and iron it down at the marks that we've made. Take your time around that curve, making sure that the fabric lays as flat as possible. Then we're going to trim that seam allowance that we folded up to 3/8 inches. Taking your inner face piece with right side face up, lay the folded seam allowance piece on top face down, so right side should be facing together, and line up that top edge. Pin it together, and we'll sew this with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Grab some scissors and cut off half of the seam allowance. Open it up and iron the seam allowance toward the collar piece without interfacing. We're going to sew this seam allowance down with a top stitch of a 1/16 inch seam allowance to keep it in place. Then we can fold the collar back the right way and iron this in place. Going back to the neckline on our blouse, we're going to line up the interfaced collar side with the raw edge of the neckline and pin this together. Sew this with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Make little clips into the seam allowance that we just made all along the curve, and this is going to help release some of the tension on the fabric so that it lays nicer. Then iron the seam allowance up toward the collar. With your blouse inside out, open up the back so that the right side is face up, and grab your zipper. Open up your zipper, and starting with the pull tab of your zipper face down, line up the left side of the zipper with the left side of your blouse. So the teeth should face inward. Line up the teeth 5/8 inches into your blouse, and you're going to start that little silver metal part on your zipper 1/8 inches from the fold of your collar. Once you have it all lined out, start pinning it down. This zipper will be sewn on with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Place your zipper foot on your machine, making sure it's attached at the corresponding side of your zipper. And you're going to line up the teeth against the edge, and you're just going to sew this all the way down. Go ahead and stop right before you get to the pull tab. Close the zipper back up, leaving a little gap at the top, and start by lining up that little silver white piece, again 1/8 inches below the fold of the collar and 5/8 inches inward from the raw edge. Then you can pin this side down as well. Open up the zipper once again, and then you can go to your machine and sew this down, making sure to switch your zipper foot over to the opposite side. Close up your zipper again. And I'm going to start by marking where the end notch on my zipper lies on the seam allowance. Then I'm just going to pin this little bit of hangover out of place for now. And we're going to match up the raw edges of that center back. And I'm going to mark where the zipper ends on the outside so I can see it. And starting from where you left off, do a 5/8 inch seam allowance up to the line you marked, making sure to back stitch. You can unpin the zipper at the bottom and line up the teeth right in the middle of that seam. Then you can pin both sides of the zipper to the seam allowance. Start from where you left off to the bottom of the zipper tape. Remember, you're only sewing this down to the seam allowance and not to your blouse. From here, we're going to close up the collar. So fold the raw edge down right where the teeth of your zipper start, and then fold the top of the collar down at the fold. So you're basically maneuvering the fabric so the edge is right before those teeth and that bottom seam allowance is tucked neatly underneath. Once you have it the way you like, go ahead and pin it down and do the same thing to the other side. You also want to make sure that the top edge of that zipper tape is tucked nicely in between as well. So it should look something like this. Then you can fold the collar down all the way around and pin it in place, making sure that bottom folded edge matches up with the thread from that seam allowance. Grabbing our two sleeve pieces next, open them so that they are right sides up, and you're gonna once again do the 2 gathering base stitches like we did on the ruffle between the top 3 dots and the bottom 2 dots on each sleeve. Take your sleeve and fold it right sides together, matching and pinning the short edge. Sew the short edge with the 5/8 inch seam allowance. Iron open both of the seam allowances, and then grab your sleeve band pieces. Lay them wrong side face up and iron on the interfacing to each piece. Fold these in half, matching the short ends, and pin it together. Sew these with the 5/8 inch seam allowance and iron the seams open as well. On your sleeve band, one side will have dots, so we're going to work with the opposite side. Fold this right side out, and on the side without dots, you're going to mark a 5/8 inch seam allowance all the way around. From here, we're going to fold this edge toward the inside where we marked and iron it down all the way around. Turn this back inside out and cut off half of that seam allowance. Gather up the bottom edge of your sleeve enough to fit in the sleeve cuff. Turn your sleeve right side out and then tuck your sleeve into your cuff with the folded edge on top. Start by matching the seam allowances, and then you're going to gather up that bottom edge so it lines up perfectly with the raw edge of your sleeve cuff. Pin them together and then distribute the gathers evenly. Sew these together with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then once again cut off half of that seam allowance. We can open up the sleeve cuff and turn this whole thing inside out, making sure the seam allowance is facing toward the sleeve cuff. Iron the seam allowance down and then fold the bottom of the cuff up toward your sleeve at the fold line. So that top folded edge should line up with the thread of the seam allowance. Then we can press the fold in the cuff down all the way around. Go ahead and pin this in place for now. Turn your sleeve right side out and determine which side the sleeve goes to by matching up the notches on the sleeve with the notches on the armhole. Place the sleeve inside the armhole and start matching up the seams, the notches, and the dots. Then you can gather up the top of the sleeve till it fits perfectly in the armhole, matching your dots there as well, and then you can pin these together too. Once again, be sure to distribute the gathers evenly. Do this to the other side as well. We're going to sew this on with the 5/8 inch seam allowance. Just like the inset, you can either sew another 1/4 inch seam allowance and then trim as close to that seam, or you can do like I did and serge the edge. We're going to hem up the bottom of our blouse by folding up the edge 3/8 inches and ironing it down all the way around. Sew this down with a 1/16 inch seam allowance, and then we'll fold up the bottom edge again another 3/8 inches, ironing it down all the way around. And then we will sew this with a 3/8 inch seam allowance or just before the edge. The very last thing to finish off this blouse is to do a slip stitch or ladder stitch, sewing down the sleeve cuffs and the collar, and then sewing on our 5 buttons. And there you should have a beautiful blouse that I'm actually a lot happier with now that I see it completed. Seeing it on the pattern really didn't do it as much justice as it does in person. So I was definitely pleasantly surprised. It is very simple, but I think it's just enough. This blouse is actually fairly simple to make as well, but maneuvering the fabric during a few parts can get a little frustrating. I have a tutorial of another Lolita blouse with a lot more detail, so I'll leave that link down below if you're interested in that. But I can't wait to use this blouse with one of my future upcoming projects. So make sure that you subscribe so you don't miss out on what I have coming soon, and hit the little bell to make sure you get notified when I upload. I want to thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Bye!